Hello and welcome back to Software Analysis and Design. Today we'll be talking about scenario-based models, first of two lectures. And today's edition is about user stories. Next time will be about use cases. So let's jump right into it. We're going to start with a brief recap of the Agile manifesto, because that's where user stories came from. Not from the manifesto, but from the practices that were derived around the principles documented in the manifesto. Then we will look at user stories, what they are, how to write them, and where they are in the life cycle, and what the benefits of those are. And then we will do a little exercise at the end where you can try them out yourself. So here we go. Just a little reminder first of the design habit. User stories are super short and concise, which means they fit in really well with that design habit we were talking about last time, which was that experts focus on the essence. So today we'll look at the most important part of the functional analysis. That is what gets captured in user stories. So look at this Agile manifesto. This is a little visual note-taking version of the Agile manifesto, and it talks about several different aspects. We talk about the highest priorities of a good communication with the customer is valued more than extensive documentation. Delivering prototypes that work in every iteration is more important than fine granular documentation of the code, and so on and so forth. There is a specific part today that we want to focus on, and that is changing requirements are welcome. So if the requirements change a lot, and we expect them to change quite a bit, what does that mean in terms of effort? That means we don't necessarily want to spend a lot of effort and a lot of time writing those requirements, because we'll be doing this a bunch of times. We will iterate, and that's okay. And user stories, on the top left in this extreme programming version, are one of the ways of how this can be done. They are a super concise version of writing down functional requirements for a system when a user is involved. And you can see in here that there is a cycle. Well, no, sorry, you can't see in here that there is a cycle. You can see that the requirements have an influence on the release planning and on the acceptance test. And then there is one arrow to the middle that says iteration. So the iterations are not quite visible in the flowchart, in the sense that you see, oh, and then the user stories get iterated. It just says all of this extreme programming project gets iterated, and out come small releases to the right. So it happens early on, and we will have to repeat it several times. And here are a couple of examples of what that could look like. As Max, I want to invite my friends so we can enjoy the service together. As Sasha, I want to organize my work so I can feel more in control. As a manager, I want to be able to understand my colleagues' progress so I can better report our success and failures. So what do you think? What are the elements? What are the elements you can identify in these user stories that all three user stories have in common? At the beginning, you see as Max, as Sasha, as a manager. So as a user of the system, as a user, maybe in a specific role. While Max and Sasha refer to individual users, the manager refers to a user role. So depending on which user you speak to, if you ask the customer who is a user, they can just speak about themselves, about their individual use of the system, because you will interview several different types of users, hopefully, and speak to them about what they need out of the system, so you can analyze that. The last one is a role. So if you elicit those requirements with a bunch of requirements engineers or other software developers, then you may want to focus more on the roles than on the individual, because the roles are what you need to think about for the design of the system. So there is an abstraction step in between those two, from the individual users to the user groups. What else do you see? I want to. I want to invite my friends. I want to organize my work, and I want to be able to understand my colleagues' progress. So there is a need that gets expressed. Like, what do you want to do with the system? And then the last part, the third part, is so I can so we can enjoy the service together, so I can feel more in control, so I can better report our success and failures. So that's the why. Summary: as a role, I want to do what, so I have, or I can do why. And here's this in a template. So who are we building the system for? Who's the user? That's the part that gets expressed in as a type of user. Second part is the what. What are we building? What is the intention? I want some goal or objective. And then why. Why are we building it? And what is the value for the customer? So that, and then I express the benefit or value. And that's it. That's all you need to write in your user story. Really all? Almost really all. So what else may we want to consider? What is different in this template? There's a couple of different templates out if you look around on the internet. Maybe you find this template. When, some situation, I want to, motivation, so I can, expected outcome. Does that sound like a user story? There is the significant difference. There is no role identified. It doesn't say, as Birgit, when I come across the circumstance, I want to blah so I can blah. No, it just says when there's a specific situation, I want to so I can. So this has to be a different type of template. It's not a user story. It is something that I came across that is a template for a job story. So if you're trying to figure out, well, what do I want to do when I grow up? What do I want to do when I go out of college? Then you can use this template. For our user stories, nope. Let's stick with, as a certain role, I want to perform a certain task so that I can achieve a desired result. That's the part that you see on the left. There is, however, a bit more of extension that may be helpful. The most important one of that for the elicitation and the testing is the acceptance criterion. So we need to understand, what are the measurable results when this user story is completed? What defines done? Maybe you remember the definition of done from what you learned about agile. I know when I'm done when. I know that I'm done when. On the right-hand side, you see a couple more characteristics that are for the project management, for the requirements management. So you see that there can be an ID for the user, there can be an importance and an estimate, and it can be a specific type, for example, for a subsystem. And there are a couple of subsystems given here: payment, report, search, manage data, workflow. So for our exercise today, we're going to stick to the left, and the parts on the right are for requirements management, which right now we're not going to consider in more detail. Why? Why do we write user stories? What are the benefits of good user stories? First of all, those are, on the very left, the building blocks of the product. So each of those user stories incrementally adds customer value to the product. We get to them over time, and we can take in all the information from our users. Even though some of those stories we may put into the backlog for now and then only get back to them later. It brings the user closer. So it makes product development revolve around customer value because it focuses on the user needs. And the more user needs we can satisfy, the happier the customer is going to be, because the more value the system can deliver. So we're really closely working together with customer value here. Which brings us to the next point: highest value delivery. because it helps us deliver the customer-focused features that do yield the highest value. That's what we do the prioritization for in collaboration with our customer. Brings us to the next point. It fosters collaboration. So it encourages collaboration among the user, the product owner, and the development team. They also help to create a shared understanding because they make us talk about the user needs. So maybe I sit together with my customer and ask him, well, what do your users really need? And then instead of the customer telling me about what they want in there, they can now take the perspective of their own users and then speak from their standpoint. And it boosts transparency between the individual team members, and that over time will also strengthen the trust between team members and in the relationship between team and customer. So there you go, 6 good reasons for why you want to write good user stories. And how do we do that? So first step, most important, define who are those end users, who will be using your product. And in this little example on the slide, as a parent, the role is a parent. Here's a woman holding a baby. Second, specify what they want. So what are you offering? In the user story here, in the example, I want to check on my sleeping baby without entering the room. As a parent, I want to check on the sleeping baby without entering the room. Okay, good. Third party, describe the benefit. What will the user gain from using your product? And in the example, that is so that I know he is safe without disturbing him. And 4, the acceptance criterion. So how do I know when the story is done? And in this case, it could, for example, be that there is an alert to be sent to the registered smartphone if a problem is detected. A couple of tips that I took from Knowledge Train on how to create a good user story is you can develop a persona profile to visualize your end user. That is something that belongs more into the area of requirements engineering. We won't dive deeper into it, but you can visit some other sources for that. Always write from your end user's perspective, for sure. Avoid adding technical details too early. So user stories are all about the what is going to get done, not about how. So I'm not saying how we're going to check on the baby without entering the room. I'm only saying that that is what we want to do. That is what we want to do. Try to add not too many acceptance criteria. 1 is good, 2 is good, keep it brief. Keep the stories brief as well and break them up if you need to. How that breaking up works, we'll get to in a second. And make sure they meet your definition of done for the iteration of the project. You ready to go? Almost? Okay. So concise, just the 4 points. Define your end user, specify what they want, describe the benefit, add the acceptance criteria. Good. Now I just said we're going to get to how do I organize my user stories. Like maybe sometimes user stories are like too large or there are several things that need to get done. So here is the way how you want to try and do that. Taken from Agile Scrum in Belgium. You have at the very top level a theme, sometimes also called an initiative. I found other sources where it's called an initiative. And that theme may have several epics, which are like parts of the functionality that we talk about. And then about each of those, we can talk in several user stories. In the example here, I have a power user. I can have my reports on my dashboard. As a power user, I can have my reports on my dashboard. Good. So there's the epic of a power user. And then as a user, I can back up my hard drive. That is an example of a user story. And then each of those user stories can be further split down into tasks if necessary. For example, if having the reports actually requires several actions, I can split those up into tasks. If the backup requires several steps, I can split that up into tasks. If checking on the baby in the room requires several tasks, you split that up. If you want to get a little more detailed, I got this one for you. So here are some very detailed instructions on how you can go about splitting user stories. Starting in the top left, prepare the input story. And then you check, does the big story satisfy the criterion of accept perhaps, or not so much? You can combine it with another story if it's, sorry, I haven't explained invest. Look down on the left, invest. Stories should be independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and testable. These are the 6 criteria for a good user story. Abbreviation, invest. Independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and testable. So with that, you look at your individual user stories and say, and ask yourself, does that big story or the one user story I'm looking at satisfy those criteria? If yes, then you can look at whether the story size is 1/10 to 1/4 of your velocity. If that is so, good, you're done. If no, you need to split it. Like, what does that even mean? 1/10 to 1/4 of your velocity. That means if in one sprint I only have one user story, then it's too large. Then my entire sprint will be one story. Instead, I try to split it up so I have several subtasks, several subparts to work on within one iteration. So if I have 4 to 10 stories per sprint, great. Second part, in case I need to split it, there are several splitting patterns that we can apply. See the arrow that says start here? That's where we're going to start. Does the story describe a workflow? If so, can you split the story so you do the beginning and the end of the workflow first and enhance with stories from the middle of the workflow? If it's not a flow, can you take a thin slice? Other option, if it is a flow, but that pattern doesn't work, can you take a thin slice to do the workflow first and then enhance it with more stories later? So one is take the flow and cut it into several steps. And the second one is take the flow and see if you can do a slice the other way around and say, I'm going to do the very basic version of it and then enhance it over time. Option 2, does the story include multiple operations? Is it about managing or configuring something? And if so, can you split the operations into separate stories? Or business rules. Does the story have a variety of business rules? For example, is there a domain term in the story like flexible dates that suggests several variations? If so, can you split the story so you do a subset of the rules first and enhance with additional rules later? Then maybe about the data. Does the story do the same thing to different kinds of data? Can you split the story so you can process one kind of data first, for example, text only, and then enhance it with other kinds later on, maybe audio or video data in addition? Does the story have a complex interface? If so, is there a simpler version? Does the story get the same kind of data via multiple interfaces? If so, can you split the story to handle data from one interface first and enhance with the other interfaces later? Another option, when you apply the obvious split, is whichever story you do first, the most difficult, and then if so, could you group the later stories and defer the decision about which story comes first? Simple versus complex. Does the story have a simple core that provides most of the value and learning? And could you split the story to do that simple core first and then enhance it later with other stories? And for deeper performance, does the story get much of its complexity from satisfying non-functional requirements like performance? And if so, could you split the story to just make it work first and then enhance to satisfy the non-functional requirements? And then we see this little dashed arrow that says last resort. If none of these patterns work for you, then you can still break out a spike and say, hey, can you find a small piece you understand well enough to start, just somewhere? Write that story first, build it, and then start again at the top of this process. If no, can you define the 1 to 3 questions that are most holding you back? If you can find those questions, write a spike with those questions, do the minimum to answer them, and start again at the top of the process. If none of that works, guess what? You got to take a break. That will also come up in the design habits, or you can find it in the book. Designers take a break. Like if you can't move forward with something, gotta go take a break, do something else, come back to it, try again. That in a lot of detail was how you can split user stories. Now, for the life cycle of a user story, there is this really nice Twitter post that I found from Dominic, known on Twitter as Downward Dom. Link is in the bottom right. And the story goes that the user stories are just conversation starters. So we're talking about just enough detail. It's about having a conversation and then confirming what this is about. So when you try to figure out your next objective, then in the alignment phase, in the inception phase, you're going to map impact, and you're going to have some epic kickoff where your stakeholders come together. You agree on what's going to be done and how is it going to be done. And you come up with small and cute user stories. When you have your small and cute user stories, then you go back and confirm. You can add details and you can plan, and then you can kick off the story, the implementation of the story. Sorry, not the implementation yet. You can kick off to add details and then figure out how to implement it. Magic happens here. We go through the implementation part, and then you verify with your customer, is this what you really wanted? And that's what happens with every sprint. So all of this story lifeline, that is one version of your user story. Maybe at that desk check, it turns out, yeah, you implemented what we talked about, but also we're having the insight that there is this one thing that needs to be changed. And then you do another iteration and go through that again. Now it's your turn. You go try some user stories, and I'll give you a couple of instructions on how. We're going to stick with the amusement park example. I would like you to develop 5 user stories for that ticketing system that we talked about in the last lecture. If you don't remember, I said choose an amusement park, preferably a larger, well-known one, so we know what we're talking about, but actually doesn't have to be that specific. Whether it's Liseberg in Sweden or Disneyland or Universal Studios or something smaller, your pick. Talk about the ticketing system where you buy tickets to get into the park, tickets for the rides, and then develop 5 user stories for that. Make sure in your stories you include different types of users. And just as a little reminder, in the bottom right corner, the instruction on how to write a user story. So define your end user, specify what they want, describe the benefit, and add the acceptance criteria. Ready to go? Go do it. Now, put the video on pause, do it. You're back? All right, then I'm just going to summarize the lecture. User stories focus on what? So they're part of the analysis, the design analysis, software analysis. It happens very early in the agile software development process, and it continues with every sprint. User stories don't say how, and they can still contain some early design choices because we are specifying what a specific role should be and what the objectives are. So all of this is part of iterations. The user story template is who does what and why. And then you add an acceptance criterion. The benefits include a shared understanding between stakeholders that leads to higher value focus for the entire software development. You organize your user stories in themes that you can break down into epics, that you can break down into stories, that you can break down into tasks. And the life cycle is you align with your stakeholders, write some user stories, confirm those, implement and verify them. And then you go through the iteration process. And with that, I thank you a lot for joining me today. Leave comments, leave questions below. I'd love to hear from you. Have a great rest of your day.